Dear friends, in this third video of the intended 5-part series, I want to shift my discussion from the biography of Novalis to philosophy. Some of you who have seen the previous 2 lecture videos may find this statement amusing. I do. After all, didn't I make a big point of saying that the fairy tale is mightier than philosophy? Well, I did, but tonight I'm going to contradict myself in the grand style of our American poet father, Walt Whitman, and I am going to talk about philosophy a bit, although I'll do it from my perspective as a poet, novelist, and retired professor of literature. But if philosophy isn't your thing, then you might want to skip to Lecture 4, Under the Sign of the Mother, in which I discuss this same material, but in a more imaginative way and in the context of the magical idealist novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen. I also want to remind folks that the purpose of these video lectures is to highlight aspects of Novalis and plant a few seeds for our 21st century, or maybe the 22nd, who knows? All right, let's get started. As you know, Rudolf Steiner placed a great deal of importance on Novalis in respect to the 21st century, especially in his last address. And one of the purposes of this video series is to unpack what Rudolf Steiner meant from within a literary context. These short lectures are not meant to be scholarly or exhaustive. Those of you who want to get deeper into the weeds of scholarship might want to take a look at my book, which has a long critical introduction and a scholarly bibliography. Now, here's a quote from a rather well-known late 20th century Germanist and literary theorist. I put it on the screen because one of the most significant reappraisals of Novalis in the late 20th century and at the beginning of our 21st century, is the critical recognition by many that Novalis was a significant philosopher, a very consequential thinker. In the years when Rudolf Steiner was alive, a reader would have been laughed out of the classroom or university if that reader had suggested that Novalis was a philosopher on par with the best of his contemporaries, for example, Kant or Fichte or Schelling, or Goethe for that matter. I have put just a few representative quotes on the screen. These are typical of the time by 2 very influential 19th century critics. You can see how disparaging they were. Readers of that era in the mid to late 19th century or early 20th century preferred a more stylized and sentimentalized Novalis, or a heroic Novalis. A 21st century reading of Novalis takes a different approach. Now, this is quite a stunning reversal of critical fortunes, and in a way, as I said earlier, it confirms Rudolf Steiner's indication in his last address and elsewhere that Novalis would be very important to our 21st century. But I should ask, have we recognized that importance? Or are we as readers still stuck in a late 19th century and early 20th century narrative? In Lecture 2 of this 5-part series, I began to prepare my detour to philosophy by explaining how Hardenberg's experiences at Sophie's grave on May 13th, that's the experience that inspired the hymns to the night, and the event on May 29th And the final summary line in his journal of 1797 on June 29th are stages of a single magical idealist process. And I referred you to Friedrich Hebel's book. And while it might seem strange to us that during the engagement and the anxious months of Sophie's worsening illness, Novalis found time and concentration to study Fichte's philosophy intensively, it is nevertheless how he spent many free hours. Moreover, he did so to such a degree that Fichte's philosophy became, for the young man, almost a daily meditation. During his engagement, Novalis sketched out in the notebook entries now known as the Fichte Studies the first outlines of magical idealism, and he and his friends sometimes fondly referred to this philosophical enterprise with humorous nicknames such as Fichtesieren or Philosophieren or Philo-Sophie. You might get the sense that they were having some high-spirited, youthful, poetic fun. And indeed they were. One might say that these early Jena romantics were the original youth section. And in the true spirit of early romantic genius, they were trying to practice enlivened thinking. That is to say, to discover how to think from the heart. In fact, they had the crazy wisdom idea, as we call it these days, that unless one discovers how to think from the heart, and with and from the body, well, unless you discovered how to do this, then the whole game of philosophy must come a cropper. Or perhaps it already has. Here's the famous fragment that many of you know, I suspect. In fact, I'd say we know it so well, some of us, that we may have lost a keen appreciation for how radical this statement is. I know for myself that it's easy to fall asleep and read this fragment like a Hallmark greeting card sentiment, as if it basically said, cheer up. But we shouldn't go to sleep because these words express some urgently needed common sense. Let me read it. The heart is the key to the world and to life. One lives in this helpless situation in order to love and to learn of one's dependency on others. Through imperfection, one becomes open to the influence of others, and this openness is just the point. In sickness, others can and should help us. So Christ, from this standpoint, is the key to the world. Now, with this fragment in mind, I think we can begin to understand how the pun Philo-Sophie, which is a pun on the name of Hardenberg's fiancée, of course, is also a very serious poetic maneuver that lays a foundation for Novalis's magical idealist theory and praxis, his poetry and his mature writings. One might argue that the magical idealist revision of Fichte's philosophy begins with this pun and with this appeal to the heart. Novalis, in youthful fashion, felt that Fichte had made a good start, but that Fichte hadn't really gotten things right. Because, to put it baldly, Fichte was too seriously stuck in his head. Novalis coined the phrase Fichtesieren, which means approximately to philosophize in the style of Fichte, but to do the Fichte's philosophy artistically, that is to say, playfully from the heart. Novalis wanted to out-Fichte Fichte, you might say, if that makes sense. He wanted to take Fichte to a place that Fichte, he thought, couldn't get to by himself. So you can look at the quote that I put on the screen, but in particular, the last line where he says that wonderful works of art can arise here after one first begins to do Fichte philosophy artistically. Now, this might be a bit disconcerting to folks who think that philosophy needs to be earnest and sober, that it's a mature pastime for serious adults. Okay, let's be earnest and sober for a moment. To understand what Novalis is getting at with his critique, we need to have some familiarity with what Fichte called intellectual intuition. Perhaps another way to translate this is spiritual intuition or spirit intuiting. Fichte's notion of intellectual intuition was a concept that greatly excited young men like the early Romantic Novalis and his earnest generation. It fired them with enthusiasm for a philosophy of freedom, in fact. Fichte, at the height of his glamour, packed his lecture halls to overflowing. And why? Well, one important reason is that he spoke to the spirit of his time, and that was the spirit of the age of revolution, the age of freedom. French Revolution, American Revolution, Industrial Revolution, you can tick them all off. In keeping with the revolutionary and iconoclastic mood of the late 18th century, Fichte sought to make free will the cornerstone of his philosophy in a spiritual sense. The I, according to Fichte's scheme, to put it baldly, freely turns its mind stream of attention back upon itself and apprehends itself in a moment known as intellectual intuition. The I comes to awareness in a free deed of willed spirit self-cognition, so to speak, as a free deed of intellectual intuition. Now, Novalis challenges this notion. He says, this momentary cognition of I is not the authentic I, but it's what Novalis called a pseudo-proposition. Or, to put it another way, Novalis challenges Fichte from the standpoint of what these days some of us call somatic wisdom. Novalis emphasizes our embodiment as time beings. He asserted, for example, that in matters of epistemology, feeling appears first, reflection appears secondarily. Why? Or, as he expressed it in a more poetic fashion, and much more to the point, I think, the first kiss is, from this perspective, the principle of philosophy, the origin of a new world. The I experience that Fichte describes, on the other hand, Novalis complained, is a Robinson Crusoe, if you recall that famous book by Daniel Defoe, with the castaway, all alone on the island with himself. And there are many fragments to this effect in Novalis's writings. I'm not just picking out the unusual ones here. Novalis complains that the I experience described by Fichte is like a character all alone in a world of one. I, me, me. Autonomous and islanded and proud to be completely alone, free, in a world of the reified self. And as an example of this 18th century revolutionary attitude, these days we hear rehearsed again the old defiant 18th century slogan, "Don't tread on me." Well, I don't know about you, but I think this is not exactly a slogan for connectedness, interrelationship, or compassionate heart wisdom, one might argue. Now, before we go any further, it is important to be clear about the terms ideal and idealism, especially since we are trying to understand magical idealism, which this lecture series tries to explain. Confusion might arise that ideal refers in this instance to a non-earthly realm of ideas, such as we find represented in Platonic philosophy. But the term ideal should not be understood here in either a Platonic or Neoplatonic sense, most especially when we couple that term ideal with the alchemical use of the word magic, as Novalis has done. So instead, in typical 18th century fashion, the word ideal refers us to the how of human knowing that Kant and Fichte and others discussed so extensively. In this respect, the word transcendental in transcendental idealism, it refers to the human mind. Hovering, or schweben, is a favorite term for Novalis, and I'd like to end this brief lecture tonight by drawing your attention to the importance of the word hovering. Schweben can be translated in various ways, of course, and arguing about a correct translation is one of the amusing pastimes of translators. I have chosen to translate the word as hovering because hovering has connotations of light, playful, eager attentiveness. One might imagine two lovers whose eyes flirt eagerly with one another as they hover brightly over one another prior to their first passionate kiss. This emphasis that Novalis places on the self-evident fact of our human embodiment as time beings creates a creative and provocative tension that is very useful for magical idealist practice. Novalis recognized this first in the Fichte studies and then throughout his writings. Here is another important fragment by Novalis in that regard, and I'll read it. All being in general, is none other than being in freedom, hovering between extremes which need to be united and need to be separated. From this focus of hovering, all reality streams forth. Everything is contained within it. Object and subject arise through it, not it through them. Egohood, or productive imagination, hovering, determines, produces the extremes that between which the hovering is happening. This is an illusion, but only in the realm of common understanding. In other respects, it is something absolutely real. For hovering, its cause, is the source, the mother of all reality, reality itself. Regard the nature of this hovering. Now, in past section meetings, we tried to do just that, to regard the nature of this hovering. We gave some close attention to one of the last poems that Novalis wrote, right before he died, and here is a portion of the poem that we studied in translation. Hovering is a very important soul attitude for the magical idealist Novalis. And while I'm running out of time tonight to discuss this any further, I can at least make you sensitive to the importance of hovering as a magical idealist attitude. And I'll say more about hovering in the next video, in which I discuss the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen.
Alle Menschen seh ich leben viele leicht vorüberschweben, wenig mühsam vorwärts streben, doch nur einem ist's gegeben, leichtes Streben, schwebend Leben.
Thank you for your attention and for your interest in the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities, and for your interest in Novalis and Romanticism. Good night.